Hello, everyone. This is Educational Assessment with Professor DeNobile. I'm your host, Professor DeNobile. This is our last official episode, episode 14, Feedback for Learning. There's one or two more bonus lectures. I'm not going to say that they're optional, but they're not official lessons for the course. But here is episode 14, all about feedback. So we're going to be looking at teacher efficacy, teacher belief in current practice, principles of feedback to increase student motivation, and then forms of feedback. So studies have shown that a teacher's belief that they can help even difficult students learn is probably one of the greatest impacts on students' learning. It's one of the few personal characteristics associated with learning. It's promoted by supportive administrators with high expectations for student success. I would also say that supportive administrators who have effective professional development to promote teacher efficacy is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of increasing student achievement. A teacher's sense of efficacy is generally high during student teaching, but lowers the first year of teaching. So we have to ask ourselves, what can you do to keep your self-efficacy intact during the first year of teaching? Whenever I personally mentor a teacher, whether they're a student teacher or if they're a first-year teacher, I will constantly have a conversation with them saying, do you feel like you know what you're doing? Oftentimes than not, they say no. And I say that's a good thing. Oftentimes, if a teacher is feeling as if they know exactly what they're doing, they're probably not doing what they're supposed to be doing. What's my point? Because this sounds like the complete opposite of teacher efficacy. The point is this: if you're humble enough to understand that you probably aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're more likely open to advice and mentorship. If you think you're hot stuff, most likely you're not going to be open to mentorship. And just like in any other field, if you're not seeking mentorship when you're a young teacher, I mean, I'm in my 16th year of teaching. I'm still seeking mentors in order for me to become a better educator, whether that's inside of the classroom or outside of the classroom. And so if you want to believe that you can make a difference, that starts by understanding that you're humble enough to say that you probably don't know everything that there is about teaching. And I just wanted to point that out to you. So teacher beliefs and current practice. I believe this is from the textbook. This is a really good assessment for beliefs and practices. And really, what is this all about? We need to understand that our beliefs and current practices are wrapped around assessing student progress aligned with learning standards. Everything about our teaching practice is wrapped into the learning targets, the learning standards, and assessing student progress. If we had to summarize what's the action of teaching in a nutshell, it's unpacking learning targets to our students, teaching those learning targets, and then assessing those learning targets. And we could look at that whether or not we're talking about it in a standardized sense, whether we're looking at preparing them for an exam, or we're talking about general standards. I mean, every course has some sort of a standard. This course has standards in which I'm trying to unpack, teach, and then assess you on. Like that, any given type of program has standards, whether it's in education or not. If you're a dentist, you have standards. If you're a doctor, you have standards. If you're a nurse, you have standards. And so that's practice in a nutshell. What's also important is student self-assessment. that they're able to self-assess their own progress on the learning targets, and that they're able to gather and evaluate their own evidence. Why is this important? Here's what I tell my students from day one. I'm not going to be here forever. I'm not going to be your teacher forever. Even though on the last day of school, I let them know that this is a lifelong process, and whether they like it for me, this is a life sentence. My point is that I'm not going to be there in the capacity of like overlord, overlord educator, where I provided the boundaries necessary for them to internalize the standards, and give them feedback. They have to do that themselves. I'm not going to be there to give them questions. They have to be there to ask themselves those questions in order to be lifelong learners. Less evidence, less emphasis on grades, more on progress. A lot of times my students become frustrated with me because they just want the number. They want to know, like, I just want a high grade. And I keep on telling them the grade means nothing, because think about it this way: 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, is it going to matter what grade you got in 10th grade English? No one's going to care. Once you graduate from high school and you're accepted into college, they don't even care about your SAT score. The SAT score got you in the door. That's it. It was a key. And it's not always a key anymore, because SAT actually doesn't hold as much weight as it did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's not about the grade. The grade, as I said in the last module, is not an objective measure of student achievement, of student ability. It's whether or not they're making progress. Are they better in any way, shape, or form, whether it is as a scholar, as an academic person, as a human being? Have they made progress from yesterday to today? Feedback is given along these lines. This is why feedback is very important, because feedback is that vehicle for progress. Oh, we're flying around. All right, here we go. So, using a variety of instructional strategies is key to unlocking student motivation, leading to enhanced learning. I really wanted to stop here because 16 years of teaching, this is my goal for this year. I want to improve my instructional strategies. I'm not a perfect teacher. I know that. I'm not the best teacher in the world. However, I have a pretty good grasp on my curriculum. I have a pretty good grasp on how to assess students. I have a pretty good grasp on building relationships with students and understanding social emotional learning. But what I really want to focus on this year to be a better teacher is looking at these instructional strategies to increase student motivation. And the reason for that is because of the pandemic. What I learned in the pandemic, as opposed to before the pandemic, is that we're in a brand new world, and students lost intrinsic motivation directly due to the pandemic, and ways to motivate them pre-pandemic, they don't work anymore. And so I need to know, I have to go back to the basics and really build on that pedagogical capital, if you will. And I have to bank on the basics in order to find different ways in order to meet the needs of my students, but also find different ways and mix it up on a weekly basis. Even if I'm focusing on one strategy each week, here's one strategy, jigsaws. This week, I'm just doing jigsaws. Every lesson, we're going to do a jigsaw for them to see what it is. And then next week, we're going to mix it up. We're going to do Socratic seminar all week. That's all we're going to do is Socratic seminar. And so that I can first master the strategy, and then get to a point where it's like, okay, Monday we're going to do jigsaw, Tuesday we're going to do Socratic seminar, and so that I can really like mix them up day by day. But right now, I just want to be able each week I want to use a different instructional strategy in order to unlock the student motivation to enhance their learning. Because the ways of doing it 3, 4 years ago, they don't work anymore. Um, some feedback principles. Feedback should be oral or written, especially at the higher grades. Sometimes we can just tell students, and feedback is given in every lesson, believe it or not. It may not be formal. We're going to talk about formal and informal feedback, but feedback is given to in every lesson. And sometimes, like, I'm becoming more and more aware of it. Like, every single student gets feedback every lesson, even if it's subconsciously given to them. In the way that I teach. And that may sound like overwhelming. How do you give feedback to like 25 to 30 kids in up to 5 different classes on a daily basis? And it's really, you have to pre-program it into your lesson in the sense of into like the discussions and how you're going to discuss with those students. Um, your feedback needs to have strengths and areas of improving, glows and grows. It needs to have both because students need to know what they're doing right and what they need to do in order to improve. Um, I'm just going to skip the evaluative descriptive because really what the feedback has to answer is the student question of what do I need to know or do? That's what the feedback has to answer. And you do that through giving strengths and areas of improvement. Feedback is evaluative, meaning you're passing judgment on the either the effort or the task itself. I'm going to suggest, based off of growth mindset, you want to evaluate effort as much as possible because effort has been shown that when you evaluate effort, growth happens more often. Because if you tell a student, oh, you're smart, you're one of the smartest students in the class, when they fail, they're not going to want to do it another time. They don't want to take the risk the next time around. But if you say, wow, your effort on this project was amazing, you did this, and this, the next time around, they're more likely to take the risk. And even if they fail, they're more likely to persevere through it. Now, evaluative is okay. I'm going to suggest that as often as possible, you want to give descriptive. Why? Good job doesn't tell a student anything. Okay, great. What about what about it was a good job? Students really need to know description of what they did and how they did and what they did to get them where they are. And the reason for that is if you just tell them good job, it doesn't give them a pathway. And it's like, okay, I did a good job. Did I do a perfect job? Did I do an excellent job? What does that even mean? What does a good job mean? And that's why descriptive is very important. It needs to be positively worded. That's why I've said in the past, we don't say strengths and weaknesses, we say strengths and areas of improvement, because a weakness sounds like something you cannot overcome, while an area of improvement is something that I can overcome. I can improve in this area and not that I'm stuck in a weakness. Added guidance where necessary. How do I improve my work? Just feedback answers on how can you improve to get to the next level. Now, every year I'm always going to have a handful of students who they get hundreds in my class, and I have to explain to them 100 doesn't mean you're perfect. 100 simply means you're meeting everything that I'm asking you to do. And this is where feedback becomes difficult, because if a student is in your class and they're at the top, then it's your job as the teacher. It's not like, okay, I walk away from this student because I have to focus on the other students who aren't doing as well as these students. Because the reality is that if you do that, if you walk away from the high achieving students, then they're going to start to slip. And what you have to do, the feedback that you give high achieving students has to be, okay, let's say they're in 10th grade and they're performing at 11th grade level, what feedback can you give them to get them to 12th grade level this year? And that's why feedback is important, because feedback isn't simply about meeting your current needs. It's meeting the needs where they're at. So if they're already here, I want to get them to here, because that's my job as a teacher, is to get them as high as possible. I've had a student that I've been working with since 9th grade, and this particular student has been at college level since 9th grade, legit college level. It doesn't mean that I do nothing with this student. My job now is to continue to cultivate it so that she remains at that high level, so that when she goes off to college, she's actually at a graduate level when she's going off to college, because she was at college level when she was in 9th grade. If I don't continue to work with that student at that high level, then I'm doing a disservice to that student, because I am not providing the type of environment to meet her specific needs, even though I have other students who have other different needs than her. Effective feedback is clear, understood, and legible. It's accurate, it's precise, it's selective, it focuses on important patterns and behaviors, and it's timely. I know for me, as I told you at the beginning of the semester, that timely piece I've been working on. I've been slipping up the last week or two or three, but I think I've been doing well overall this semester. But it's important to be timely. And the reason for this is this: think of effective feedback as detention. And it's going to sound weird in the sense of, because I just said be positive, but I'm going to put it in these terms. Let's say a student has misbehaved. They misbehaved on Monday, but you don't give them detention until Friday or the following Monday. How effective is that detention? Well, it's so far away from the original incident that student is not going to understand why they're in detention, and that detention is going to be useless at that point. In the same way, feedback is just the same. If the assignment was on Monday and you don't get the feedback to them within 48 to 72 hours, that feedback is going to be difficult to be effective. It's still going to work. It's still going to be useful to the student, but it's not going to be as useful as it could be if you could have given them it within 48 to 72 hours. And also think of it from the point of view of medicine. If a teacher-student relationship is similar to a doctor-patient relationship, you want, when I'm going to my doctor, I want my doctor to be clear. I want him to be understood. If he's writing something down, I want it to be legible. I want it that I'm able to read it. If he's telling me what I could do to improve my health, I'm hoping my doctor is accurate, because if my doctor's not accurate, I'm going to have problems. I want him to be precise. I can't have him tell me, if something's wrong, you have, 6 to 72 months to live. A doc, you got to give me something more for me to work with there, because that's not helping me in order to make the decisions that I need to make. And I want him to be focusing on select important patterns and behaviors, because if there are things that I can work on later on, I'd rather work on something that I can work on now. And then once I achieve this health benefit now, I can work on something else later on. And think of your effective feedback like that. Every year, you're going to have students who are going to have so many needs, and they have to work on 100 different things. But you know what? If we can focus on 2 or 3 of them right now, hopefully by the end of the school year, we can address, 75% of that 100. Hopefully. But how much better is that student going to be if you were able to address 2 to 3 every single week for the 180 school days in the school year? They're going to be so much better later on for the following school year, that they're not going to have 100 different things they have to address the following school year. They may only need, 30 different things that they need to address because you took the time to address only 2 to 3. Small wins now equal big wins later. What types of feedback are motivating? We have formal and informal feedback. Oftentimes we shy away from the formal feedback. Other times we also shy away from informal feedback, but informal feedback is just important as formal feedback. Our formal feedback are typically standardized. They're in our rubrics. They're in our standardized exams. They're structured. They're in test scores. They're evaluative. They're judgmental. Informal feedback is in dialogue. Like I said, I give feedback every single day in my classroom. And it's usually in classroom discussion, in classroom dialogue. It's unstructured, it's improvement focused. And why is informal feedback important? Because when it counts on an assignment or on a test, that should not be the first time the student hears it. If the student hears it in an informal setting, in a lesson, when it does count, when it's game day, you could also think of education in terms of sports. If you are a player and you need to improve on something in order to help win the game, you don't want to hear your coach talking about it on game day. You're hoping your coach was talking about it 3, 4, 5 practices ago, because then you can do something about it. You can't do much if you need to improve something in your sports performance. There's very little you could do on game day, but you could do it 4, 5, 6 practices ago and work on it on every single practice. Forms of feedback: verbal, nonverbal, written. Think of forms of feedback as imparting judgment of a child's strategies and skills, or a child's attainment in relation to goals, and giving information about those judgments. So there's different ways in which we provide feedback. Understand that nonverbal, meaning like if you're sitting with a student and you start rolling your eyes, that's a form of feedback. And we have to be aware of our nonverbal forms of feedback as well as our verbal and our written. Feedback strategies are evaluative and descriptive. Evaluative deals with rewards and punishments, approval and disapproval, value and motivation. Remember, that's like good job, not so great. What's really important are the descriptive, which deals with right and wrong answers and why they're right and wrong answers. They specify and imply better ways to do something, and they get children to suggest ways to improve themselves. So looking at our descriptive forms of feedback, there's a little bit of telling a child no and getting the child to know. So how can we do it? Very Socratically, using the Socratic method, we can re-question to get them to know. So for example, let's say you have a child and they said orange and blue rhyme. Well, you can say, sorry, kid, no, they don't. Does that help them? Or what if you did this? Okay, orange and blue rhyme. Well, what are some other words that rhyme with orange? Courage. It's a forced rhyme, but it's almost there. Courage. Do you still think orange is a good rhyme for blue? Does courage rhyme with blue? And so there, what you're really doing is you're Socratically questioning the child to come to their own understanding instead of you just saying, sorry, kid, you're wrong. My students laugh at me sometimes, and because sometimes I'll say something to the effect of, I see where you're going with that, but what about this? And they go, Mister, why didn't you just tell me that I was wrong? And I typically tell them that because oftentimes it's not important whether or not the answer is right or wrong. Really, what is important is how you got there, because how you got there is why you made the mistake. It's a mistake in the thinking process. It's not a mistake in the answer. Because if we improve our process of thinking, oftentimes we will improve in our answer choices. And the problem with like English, for example, as opposed to math, English, there aren't right answers most of the time. A lot of times it's about interpretation, and really it's getting students to understand that it's valid interpretations that are important. What are invalid interpretations? Where you get valid evidence from your text to support your interpretation. Oftentimes in math, I hate math, it's evil. That's a whole nother story. But oftentimes in math, the reason why I hate it is because it's not so much that there are right and wrong answers. It's my brain doesn't think that way. And so because my brain doesn't think that way, I oftentimes get the wrong answer is because I haven't trained my brain into the thinking process of certain mathematical exercises. A different way of telling a child yes is not so much as saying like, good job, do it again. It's more in the sense of how do you help them rewrite or restate for that yes? Again, asking correct respondents to elaborate. Because again, it's not about the fact that they got the right answer. It's how do they think their way to that right answer? And then here's like an open-ended question. Is there a right and wrong for young children? I would often say that yes, there is. Um, but this is like in education for the last 30 or 40 years, you know, should we be correcting children? I know, for example, in ELA, when it comes to grammar, there was inventive spelling and inventive grammar that they decided, let students get comfortable experimenting with language and we'll correct them later on. I personally think if you wait too long to correct them, they're not going to correct them when they need it. Here's an example. So inventive spelling was, for example, if an elementary student spelled cat K-A-T, 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 you didn't correct them. You didn't say it was wrong. And then you would correct them later on in, like, let's say middle school or high school to correct them. I don't feel comfortable with that, but my point is that has been the debate for the last 30 or 40 years. Not only about what an answer is in terms of being right and wrong, but why is an answer right or wrong? Some form of evaluation, like well written. As I said earlier, oftentimes this isn't enough. Like, okay, what does well written mean? What did I do? So providing a description as to why it's well written will provide information for the student to improve on their writing. You did an excellent job of supporting your main idea with 3 relevant details. These details help me know more about your overall concept and help you make a strong concluding statement. The student now knows this is what I did right. It confirms a child achievement and informing of acceptable performance. And one of the things we have to ask is written feedback always useful with primary grade students? And the thing here is always going to be reading level. If a student doesn't know how to read, how effective is written feedback? That's why oftentimes when it comes to a lot of assessment in the early grades, there's a lot of oral assessment because students tend to know how to express themselves orally before they know how to express themselves in written form. So achieved or not achieved, it's important for helping children organize what they have accomplished, and letting them know in terms of goal language. Did they meet the goal or did they not meet the goal? And therefore, the feedback should be written in the language of the goal. As I've said earlier, that's where the standards come in. The goal is the standards. So why don't we use the language of the standards to let them know whether or not they've achieved it? Provide the child with a summary of what they have demonstrated, that they have learned. Why have they learned it? That goes back to purpose. So learning targets usually provide purpose and as well as with it as the goal itself. And And what if we want to suggest to a student of a better way of doing something? Let's say you're observing a student and they're performing the task incorrectly. Is it helpful to go up to them and say, "You're doing it wrong. Try again"? Well, maybe. I think it depends on the task. However, how beneficial would it be, or how much more beneficial would it be if you go up to that same student and you start asking questions? Oh, what are you doing? Oh, you doing that? Why are you doing that? Interesting. What made you decide to do it that way? And as you're breaking it down to them and you're seeing their thought process, then you can go in and re-explain the task directions and the goals and have the student retry again. That's going to help them better understand the expectations. Oftentimes, students are probably performing a task incorrectly because they didn't hear the task, because they were distracted when you were giving them the directions. And oftentimes it's because they're just kids and they don't know what they're doing half the time. That's how it's been in my experience anyway. So we have to give them the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, we have to be patient and, you know, even if all they want to know is what is the answer, your job isn't to give them the answer. Your job is to help them learn how they can teach themselves how to learn. Um, get children to suggest ways to improve themselves, or another way of this is commands versus questions. Sometimes commands work, sometimes questions are better. So, for example, go back and check your work. If a student is asking me for feedback on an essay in which the deadline hasn't come yet, um, I'll read it over. I may not give them the answers up front because they're still in the process of writing it. So I'll be like, go back and check it. Go back and see what you did there in the introduction, because that's going to set up your whole essay. And so it lets them know that I'm telling them without saying you did something wrong, but I'm communicating that in that statement. Tell me how you did this. That's a command, but it really helps me gain insight into their thought process. What would make this better? Um, so you are acknowledging the fact that there's some sort of an error, there's something that's wrong here. However, it's growth mindset. Here's your current product. How do you think you can make this better? So what if we did this? Well, how would this change things? This is a very interesting question because it really forces students to reflect on their process. And it may not necessarily mean that what they did with their product was wrong, but you're trying to figure out in a different setting, in a different situation, what if we change things up? How would this change what you wrote? What do you want to do next? So let's say you're helping them write an essay. As the English teacher in me, I go back to essays. You're helping them write an essay, and they're not ready for the conclusion yet. So they need to do another body paragraph. So you're like, oh, okay, so what's your next body paragraph? What is that going to look like? Because now you're assessing whether or not they figured out the pattern yet. How could you improve this work? Just like earlier, what would make this better? That's just another way of saying it. How can you change this in order to make it better? It's just another way of it may sound like it's circulatory, but oftentimes it's about spiraling back in and trying to really dive deep into their thinking process. In summary, effective feedback points out positives as well as areas of improvement. Feedback needs to point out details related to the central focus and the objectives, aka the standard being assessed. Even using the language of that standard in the feedback. Students need to know what the language of the standard is, because the language of the standard, one, is going to be in their standardized exam, but the language is about mastery of the content. Showcase your ability to adapt your instruction to the student's needs and feedback. Provide next steps when possible. Effective feedback is another example, and our final example for the course, formally speaking, of how assessment drives instruction. I have 2 bonus lessons that are going to be here, including artificial intelligence and Chat GPT, which I feel is very important, especially if you're teachers that are going to be teachers in the next few years. Chat GPT is going to be a force to be reckoned with. So you really need to be conscious about what it is, what it does, and how it's going to be a challenge in education. That is our last official episode. I will see you on GroupMe. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.